Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back. We're joined now by Simone Ledeen, who is a senior fellow at the University of Texas at Austin Strauss Center for International Security and Law. And Ms. Ledeen was also the former Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Middle East Policy during the Trump administration. Welcome to Washington Journal.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
So as a former top Department of Defense official, I'm sure you've been watching very carefully these escalating tensions in the Middle East. And if I could first get your response to these latest missile strikes against Israel by Iran earlier this week, and then the U.S. role in helping Israel to thwart those strikes.
Sure. Well, I think it's safe to say that Iran learned from its first missile attack against Israel in April, because in this one, they were able much more successfully to penetrate Israel's air defenses. A lot more missiles actually struck the ground, were not knocked down en route by various methods, including Israel's robust air and missile defense. And so I think it's clear they learned a lot from April and the defensive actions that they saw Israel and Israel's partners take, and adjusted accordingly. So I think, initial reports were that nothing was hit, and where the missiles landed were just empty spaces. I think follow-up reporting has shown there might have been some military targets that perhaps were struck. I know Israel's being understandably extremely quiet about that, but I feel very comfortable saying that this was much more successful than the last one. Although thankfully there were no casualties other than one individual who was hit by a falling piece of rocket that was actually knocked down by the Iron Dome.
Remind everyone what prompted these latest strikes.
Well, the story begins a year ago on October 7th. Hezbollah, which has been sort of the de facto ruler of Lebanon for several years now, unfortunately. They are a terror proxy of Iran, just as Hamas is. And Hamas, of course, launched the attack into Israel on October 7th. Israel has been responding to that attack and responding to additional attacks by missiles, by rockets, by terrorists who have infiltrated into Israel's borders, and that also, I suppose I should back up and say part of what happened on October 7th was not just Hamas's infiltration of an invasion of Israel from the south, but also huge rocket barrages began on that day or soon after from the north, from Lebanon, from Hezbollah. And so there are thousands of Israeli civilians who live in the north of the country who have been evacuated and have been away from their homes for the last year. So the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, announced that one of the goals of this war, which was launched in response to the October 7th attack, was to return the civilians who live in the north to their homes. And so in order to do that, they have to move Hezbollah back from the southern border of Lebanon, the northern border of Israel. And so that's what Israel's been doing. Now, in order to accomplish this, they've been attacking very successfully, I might add, Hezbollah senior leadership and now mid-level leadership as well. And most famously and most successfully last week, actually eliminating Nasrallah, who was the head of Hezbollah. So Iran stated that they launched this missile attack last week in response to Israel's successful targeting of Hassan Nasrallah. And really, to me, that also highlights uh, the fact that we've all been saying for many, many years, because it's true, that Hezbollah is one of Iran's proxies, terror proxies, and actually the largest and sort of most fearsome. It's a terrorist army. And so really Iran took the mask off in all ways, saying they were going to, and actually followed through on it, launch a massive missile attack on Israel to try to punish them for eliminating Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of one of their terror proxies.
You mentioned Lebanon, which Israel has continued this operation against Hezbollah. But I wonder if you can talk about the scope of Israel's operation in Lebanon in terms of their aerial strikes, where they're hitting, and also the ground movements there.
Well, their ground movements have been very quiet. I think it's come out now in public that they've been operating there. Their special operations forces have been operating there for a number of months, possibly in the days and weeks, beginning in the days and weeks following October 7th. I have no special information on that other than what I read in the media. But they have been launching strikes against weapons depots, against meetings where where Hezbollah leadership meets. Obviously, this has also been a mix. Their operations against Hezbollah have been a mix of military operations and intelligence operations. Beginning, I mean, this is now. I eagerly await the movie about this, but there was the what people are talking about as the beeper operation, where the Israelis were able to successfully detonate small amounts of explosives that they had hidden in beepers that Hezbollah was using to communicate with its members. And they had purchased these beepers, trying to communicate securely, and instead they were actually detonation devices. It turns out they're small explosive devices. And then they had these walkie-talkies that also turned out to have explosives in them, which clearly the Israelis had implanted or produced at one point or another. And finally, when all of these modes of communication not only failed, but ended up seriously harming or killing Hezbollah members, a number of them met in person, and Israelis struck that meeting and successfully eliminated a number of Hezbollah leaders in that strike as well. So they've been taking a number of strikes. I think in the last few nights, and prior to that as well, they've also been hitting Hezbollah targets in Beirut. Unfortunately, similar to Hamas, a lot of these weapons storage facilities and a lot of these weapons production facilities are intentionally built inside of or underneath of civilian housing, schools, hospitals, in order to win a public relations war, being able to say Israel took the strike, and in this strike they targeted a hospital, they targeted a school, they've killed X number of civilians. And it's a hugely tragic situation for everybody, but most especially the innocent civilians that are caught and in the crossfire and trapped. And so, and also, I include Israeli civilians, Lebanese civilians, Palestinian civilians. It's a hugely tragic situation with a lot of suffering, and it's very tough to watch.
We'll be taking your calls shortly. Republicans at 202-748-8001, Democrats at 202-748-8000, and Independents at 202-748-8002. Simone, you mentioned the extraordinary death toll and civilian casualties in Gaza, but also what we're seeing in Lebanon, particularly in densely populated areas like Beirut. The Biden administration has consistently urged the Israeli government to exercise restraint when it comes to Iran. President Biden has been urging Israel not to strike Iran's nuclear weapons sites, and then there's also the risk of oil reserves. What is your assessment of President Biden and the Biden administration's ability to limit further escalation of this conflict?
Well, I think that it's clear that the leverage that the Biden-Harris administration used early in this conflict doesn't carry the same weight that it once did. So I think Rafah was a real turning point, in my opinion. I believe that Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Sorry, Rafah is the border crossing with Egypt where a lot of the humanitarian aid was moving through.
Yes, thank you. And there was a big public outcry against the Israeli government not to go into Rafah for humanitarian reasons, and they ended up going in. They ended up going in very, very slowly, and actually using tactics that others who are experts in urban warfare have said not even the United States used when we were entering terrorist strongholds like Mosul under ISIS control. That we didn't even use that kind of discipline that the Israelis used. I'm not an expert in urban warfare, but I have read enough experts to understand that they were hugely successful in Rafah, not only because they were able to accomplish their goals there, but also which included rescuing several hostages alive. Unfortunately, they also recovered additional hostages later, but they had been murdered by Hamas. So I think that was sort of a turning point in many ways, because so much pressure had been applied by the Biden-Harris administration not for the Israelis not to enter Rafah, and the fact that they did and that they achieved their goals for entering Rafah, I believe actually changed their calculus, and so I don't know. I'm not sure how much the Israelis are listening to the Americans at this point, unfortunately. Of course they are, but I think they also view this as a massive strategic opportunity for themselves, which it is. They have Hezbollah and Hamas both sort of on their heels, and these are both very, fearsome opponents, especially Hezbollah. And I think there's an opportunity now for Israel to really hold Iran accountable for all of this, because all of this really is, at the end of the day, the Iranian regime that's been the puppet master in all of this. And so I think from a strategic perspective, and regardless of what happens in our presidential election here, there's going to be a new administration. I think Israel's calculus is clearly get as much done now as possible. So I think that's what we're watching play out at the moment.
Let's go to your calls now. Elizabeth is in Las Vegas, Nevada, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Good morning. What a very, very heavy... Are you there?
Yes, we're here. Go ahead.
Okay. What I wanted to say, what a very, very heavy subject that we're discussing today, because this problem that is happening in the Middle East is thousands and thousands of years old. And what is so ironic about the whole situation is at the root of it all is a dispute about God. And, that just seems so, like we're totally going down the wrong path when they're fighting over territory about God and this and that. And of course, Israel has a right to retaliate to Hamas in regard to what they did on October 7th, which was horrific, was absolutely horrific. But the absolute slaughter of the hundreds of thousands of Gaza people who were slaughtered over it, and Benjamin Netanyahu, who absolutely feels that he has to wipe out Hamas, there's absolutely no way that he's going to be able to wipe out Hamas. You may wipe out a body, you may kill the flesh, but you cannot kill the mind. The mind of these people are going to remember what was done to them.
So, Elizabeth, I want to give Simone a chance to respond to some of the points that you've made. And, Elizabeth, you mentioned hundreds of thousands of people being killed in Gaza. The latest numbers that we have seem that it's upwards of 40,000 people, getting close to 42,000. Go ahead, Simone.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that these numbers are actually being put out by Hamas. And so I would just urge all sort of critical thinkers out there to look at who the source is on the number of casualties. And I'm certainly not discounting the fact that there have been civilian casualties, unfortunately, for the reasons, mostly for the reasons that I mentioned. The fact that these organizations are building and have built their weapons storage facilities, manufacturing facilities, and actually even hide within civilian populations. So I have to, I guess, take, I don't agree with the caller's assertion that this is about God. I mean, perhaps all things are about God. I don't think that's what this session this morning is about. But I do think that this right now specifically is about a country of people wanting to live in peace in a dangerous neighborhood, and they were attacked on a holiday and horrific things were done to them, and they are now making sure that this never happens to them again. That's fundamentally what this is about. And the folks that they're fighting really, at the end of the day, are being directed by the Iranian regime, which has stated that its goals are death to Israel and, by the way, death to America. And they've said many times, Israel is the small Satan and the United States is the great Satan. And so what we're seeing play out in Israel and these attacks against Israel perhaps are only part of the story, ultimately, and part of the Iranian regime's strategic view of this global battlefield. And that's certainly my understanding of the situation. And why it's important to really be honest about this isn't an Israel-Palestine thing. This isn't an Israel-Gaza thing. There's also a lot of activity in the West Bank now. Iran is pouring weapons and money into the West Bank in order to foment continued, violence and attacks. It's the Palestinian people are suffering under this too. And I think it's important to say that their leadership, both Hamas and through the Palestinian Authority, has been incredibly corrupt, incredibly violent, and really hasn't given Palestinians the opportunity to live and grow in a positive direction. A lot of them have been propagandized to the point where it's almost like some sort of death cult, and many people have called it that, just existing to destroy another group of people. So I think there's a way out of this. I think President Trump, during the Trump administration, which I was proud to be part of, I think began kind of a new way, introduced a new way of looking at the Middle East and our role in it. And I think that was really positive, and
Well,
I would like
speaking
to
of
see
which,
I would like to see that continue.
so speaking of which, we actually have a tweet similar to this effect. Fizz Guy says, please ask Ms. Ledeen if she believes Netanyahu is holding back Gaza's ceasefire for this November's election. He's clearly not focused on the hostages.
Well, I don't know Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I haven't asked him this question, obviously. I do know here in the U.S., it's clear that our administration is really focused on domestic political considerations. I think if Prime Minister Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu, were actually focused, just using logic, if he were focused on our November election, I'm sure in some sense that he is, but if he were trying to help one candidate or another, I don't know. I don't think he would be doing what he's doing now. Of course, there have been some President Trump, former President Trump, encouraged Prime Minister Netanyahu with whatever the Israeli response will be to Iran's latest missile attack. But I don't know. It's hard to personally. I don't like ascribing intent to people I don't know. So it's difficult for me to say one way or another what I think Prime Minister Netanyahu is thinking about one thing or another. I think when he does things, you can sort of try to understand the motivation for that, but I think we all have different lenses through which we view those things. So.
We've got a bunch of folks who have questions for you. Let's hear from Tim in Westby, Wisconsin, on our line for Democrats. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, thank you. Tomorrow is the first anniversary of October 7th, and it's a sad day, and my heart goes out to the people of Israel for what happened that day. But I guess my question is, the border with Gaza is, 25 miles long around it, or 30 miles around the whole perimeter, maybe 40. How on earth did the IDF and Netanyahu, who knew that the Hamas had been tunneling and building bombs and things for 15 years, not have that border defended on October 7th? I mean, you would have thought that they would have a bunch of armor and tanks and stuff guarding that border constantly to make sure that something like that could not have happened. Plus, according to reports I've heard, they were forewarned that Hamas was up to no good. They were planning an attack. And instead of focusing on Gaza, they were focusing more on the West Bank and setting up new settlements. Could you answer that question for me, please? Thank you.
That's a really important question, and thank you for asking it. I actually had the opportunity to travel to Israel and down to the south to the border with Gaza back in late May, and I was able to go down and see. I spent part of a day in Kfar Aza, one of the kibbutzes that was attacked, where there's still some of the hostages came from there. There was a fence, unmanned fence, chain link fence, essentially, with a lot of sensors on it, and so Israel, as it's important to note, was relying on cameras and sensors, and they had a base near the border where it was sort of an observation post where there were soldiers that were monitoring the videos and sensors. Now, it turns out, and we've learned subsequently, that base was manned by mostly female soldiers, young female soldiers. Many of the soldiers are young. They're drafted into the military. They have mandatory military service in Israel right after they complete high school. These soldiers were, by and large, not armed, so they did not have weapons. And some of them, as well, remain hostages. Some of them were killed and probably raped and tortured as well. And so that was I think you could say that was both a tactical failure and a strategic failure on the part of Israel. And I have also read similar reports to you that there were indications and warnings that Hamas was planning this attack. And from what I understand, the intelligence analysts who were reviewing this information at a senior level decided that they weren't going to invade. And obviously,
so, Simone, some of that reporting that you're referencing is in the Wall Street Journal. Here's a story here from October the 4th, how the massacre of ignored female soldiers came to symbolize October 7th failures. The women stationed at Nahal Oz warned authorities for months about increasingly suspicious Hamas activity, but no one acted. And apparently, for months, there were warnings coming from those female soldiers. Let's go to Ed in New Jersey on our line for Independence. Good morning, Ed.
Yeah, good morning. I think if we want to get to the origins of the problem in the Middle East, we don't have to go back 2,000 years. We have to go back 107 years to the Balfour Declaration of November of 1917. Reading people will know that it was the Foreign Secretary, David Balfour, who said that Britain should help establish a homeland in Israel or homeland in the Middle East for Jewish people, but don't dispossess the Arab people. So since November 1917, we've had problems in the Middle East. Recently, alternate sources have revealed that over 700,000 people have left Israel. I think these people can see the writing on the wall. Also, I would say that Hamas and Hezbollah are not proxies of Israel, of Iran, but they are allies. A proxy is just a puppet. Hamas and Hezbollah have their own problems with Israel. They're being exterminated. So Iran is just assisting them. They are not proxies of Iran. Thank you.
Would you like to go ahead and respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think this caller, as stating selected and factually incorrect information. Do you want me to? I'm happy to respond piece by piece. Or I think the Balfour Declaration. So there have been Jews continuously living in what today is called the State of Israel for thousands of years, and I think there have been people who were displaced, both on the Jewish Israeli side and as well on the Arab Palestinian side. There have been a number of wars where its neighbors have attacked Israel. In the 1968, you have the war. You have the Yom Kippur War, and so I think there are two clear examples where, again, Israel wanted to live in peace. Israel was attacked. Israel responded, and Israel won, and against all odds, really, in both cases, and suffered horrible casualties as a result. But, at the end of the day, Israel actually won and in winning got more land, and especially in the first instance, in Israel's, well, and there was also a War of Independence in 1948 where Israel's neighbors attacked it as well. So they've in at least in the first case, the neighboring Arab countries to Israel told the Arab inhabitants of Israel, come here while we win back, or we win this country, and make Israel another, Arab state in this region. And they left, waiting to come back to a new Arab state. And in fact, they lost. All of these Arab nations lost. And so these people who had been living there, some of them were displaced and unable, or didn't try even to go back to where they were living before. It's very complex. And I would just caution people who think that they understand, they have a good grip on all of these different elements. It's not that simple. Also, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, a number of Shia militias in Iraq, these are all terror proxies of Iran. They are the instigators of this violence, and have caused tremendous suffering throughout the region. The whole reason for this is because of the Iranian regime's view that, Shia Islam is the way. And so not only do they have this tension, which sometimes spills over into violence with its Sunni neighbors, but also with the one Jewish state, with Israel.
Charlene is in Yucaipa, California, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Charlene.
Good morning. Yes, I like to say I think that Bibi is being influenced by trillionaires. They're working against Mr. Biden, President Biden. I think it's wrong. All them innocent children and women being murdered over there. Hey, you got to have a heart the size of a mustard seed. Bibi is covering his own butt, just like Mr. Trump is trying to cover his by selling us down the drain. The Arabic people, the leaders over there with their mustard seed hearts, they're using their people as ammunition, just like Bibi is using the Jews as ammunition. I think they need to stop mass murdering, and I think President Biden should give them no more ammunition. There's no real rhyme or reason. There's nothing biblical about mass murdering. They need to stop. Can't justify it.
Any thoughts to add there, Simone?
Yeah, I think it's a real tragedy how successful the propagandizing has been to convince normal, regular folks that the slaughtering and mass murder is on the part of the Israelis, the Israeli government, which is actually reacting in self-defense to the slaughter and mass murder of its own people, a people who have historically been one of the most slaughtered and mass murdered of all time. So I think using statements like mustard seed heart, I think I don't think that is helpful when you're trying to look at and understand a complex situation in a clear-eyed way. And I also think that ignoring the plight of Israelis and the situation that Israel is in today, and by the way, I think it's worth noting that Israel many times has acted quietly to help save American lives and has shared information directly saving American lives over the years. I think it's truly an incredible statement on the level of propaganda and the success of that propaganda, that normal folks would actually believe that the side that is massacring people is the good guys' side. And I regret that's the case. I think that also is part of this tragedy.
Babak is in London, England, on our line for Independence. Good morning.
Thank you for taking my call. I'm Babak from London. I'd like to ask your guest if she could explain the inconsistency in the Biden-Harris foreign policy. On one hand, when it comes to Ukraine, they act very Churchillian. But when it comes to Iran, they become Chamberlain, never Chamberlain, appeasement. And this inconsistency is confusing allies in the region. If your guest could kindly elaborate on this confusion.
Well, that's a very deep and very good question. I agree with the caller that the Biden-Harris administration's policy of appeasement towards Iran, I believe it is clearly a policy of appeasement. And I have to say that the Biden-Harris policy towards Ukraine, Russia, makes only a little bit more sense to me. I think that, first of all, when you enter into a war, when you pick a side, as the Biden-Harris administration did, and I think it's also worth noting that President Biden sort of dared Putin initially to invade Ukraine, which I watched just aghast when that happened. But I think they've withheld so many necessary arms from Ukraine. And when I say necessary, it's like when you decide you pick a side, you want the side you're backing to win, you really need to follow through and give them what they need to win. And that hasn't been the case. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not advocating necessarily for that. I have a lot of questions about our involvement in Ukraine, and especially as someone who worked a lot. I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan early in my career, and I saw a lot of things that happened with our U.S. dollars and U.S. aid that went into these places. And so I have the same questions. What kind of checks and balances are we applying in Ukraine? It's very hard to tell. And personally, I think Congress could do more in questioning what are we doing and why, and what is our desired strategic end state here as well with respect to Ukraine. With respect to Iran, the administration began with a very clearly stated goal that they wanted to turn the page on the Iran relationship, and to them that meant appeasement. That meant reopening the coffers. That meant no longer enforcing our very strong sanctions regime against Iran, and began these talks that went nowhere, wanted to re-enter the JCPOA, which they have failed to do. And so I think, ultimately they've been unwilling and really unable to change their view or admit failure. And we've seen that play out, and it's turned our world into a much more dangerous one. We have hot wars now in the Middle East and in Europe, which we did not have during the Trump administration.
See if we can get in a couple more folks before we finish up. Anthony in Greentown, Pennsylvania, on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Anthony.
Good morning, Kimberly. Good morning, Ms. Ledeen. Good morning, C-SPAN. In the spirit of the last two callers, I just want to comment, and the idea of the mustard seed heart. The foreign policy of this administration, the current administration, Biden-Harris, Harris-Biden, or however you want to put it, has mustard seed brains. They don't think before they act. They just gave $157 million to Lebanon. Lebanon is controlled entirely by Hezbollah. So, in effect, our government, Ms. Harris and Mr. Biden, with the mustard seed brains, just gave Hezbollah $157 million to do what they want, probably by nobody in Lebanon is going to see that money except for the terrorists, all right, or the freedom fighters, or whatever you want to call them. But that money is now wasted and is going to be used to fight Israeli IDF soldiers. And I think that the foreign policy of this administration has been incompetent since day one. Biden has no idea what he's doing, and Harris has no idea what she's doing. They're totally incompetent with mustard seed brains. Thank you.
Before I get your response to Anthony's point, just quickly, I wanted to point to the story in military.com about thousands more troops attack aircraft heading to the Middle East as Israel targets Hezbollah in Lebanon. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is sending several thousand more U.S. troops and aircraft to the Middle East as Israel continues to increase its attacks against Hezbollah. Austin ordered aircraft units and their associated personnel set to leave the Middle East region to remain in the area, and those set to replace them will instead join alongside them. And the Secretary also increased the readiness of additional U.S. forces to deploy, elevating our preparedness to respond to various contingencies. In addition to the funding to Lebanon that the caller referenced, what is your assessment of the movement of U.S. resources into the region in response to all of this?
Yeah, I think the caller made a couple of important points, and the announced aid to Lebanon, I agree, it's going to go straight to Hezbollah, and also I would just add that's 157 million that Iran will not have to give to Hezbollah. Iran now has those funds freed up to do other things. So I just wanted to make that point. But the announcement that we're sending yet more troops into the Middle East is not something that I don't think that's a good idea, because the troops that we have in the region are not, we've announced many times, we're not helping Israel, we're not doing anything, we're not going to, if I believe so far what we've done is assist Israel with some defensive actions. And so our announced strategy is just to be there to play defense, and from my perspective, just, be bullet catchers. They're just sitting there as, I don't want to say as target practice. I'm from a military family, but it is very distressing to see this and ask ourselves, what is the desired strategic end state here? There was really good optic yesterday from the CENTCOM commander, General Kurilla, who is in Tel Aviv, and CENTCOM released a statement that they're coordinating with Israel. That's great. That's great. And hopefully that will be some sort of deterrence. But we have lost a lot of the power that we had previously, where we had established deterrence because we took action, and not just offensive action, but we messaged through certain activities that do not mess with us, you will regret it. And we followed up with action to show we mean it. That has not been the case. And we can look to, a number of things, like the Houthis. The Houthis are a Yemen-based, Shia, Iran-backed, a terrorist proxy to Iran. And they've grown. There's a long history there I won't get into, but the bottom line is they've been attacking shipping in the Red Sea, and they have effectively disrupted shipping in the Red Sea, resulting in a lot of ships and big container ships actually taking 2 extra weeks to transit. They have to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. And when they're traveling, between Asia and the West. And I think it's just crazy that we don't acknowledge that we've had U.S. Navy ships there, quote unquote, trying to reestablish deterrence. But It's like
we are just about out of time, and there's so much complexity to this story that we will have to get into another day. But I really do appreciate your time, Simone Ledeen, former Deputy Assistant Defense Secretary for Middle East Policy in the Trump administration, now a senior fellow at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who called in today joining us for Washington Journal. We're going to be back tomorrow with another edition of the show at 7 a.m. Eastern. Please tune in.